everybody. It's Mental Health Awareness Month, so what better time than now to talk about writing mental health in fiction? Today we are talking trauma, PTSD, and CPTSD, and how to properly and effectively input these concepts into your writing. Butters is here joining us today. Say hello, Butters. Hello. She wants to learn about trauma and PTSD as well. She's very, very excited. Besides Butters, I have a very special guest with me. Iona Wayland is a dark fantasy author like myself. Her book Ashes was my favorite read of 2021. It's an amazing, dark, twisted, and hopeful story, and it's also an allegory for trauma. Iona Wayland is also a trauma-specialized mental health professional. She works with trauma survivors on a daily basis, so if anyone knows this stuff, it's Iona. And on top of that, she is also a sensitivity reader. Writers hire her to make sure they portray mental health, mental illness, and trauma properly in their writing. So when I say this woman is a pro, I mean she's a pro. I put together your 10 most popular questions about writing trauma, PTSD, and CPTSD, and Iona is here to answer them right now. Are any of your questions on the list? Stick around to find out. I'm super excited to have my good friend and one of my favorite writers here on the channel today. Iona, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Iona Wayland. As Jenna said, I am a trauma therapist, but I'm also a dark fantasy writer and a sensitivity reader.
Iona is going to answer your 10 most popular questions about writing trauma, but before we dive in, if you want even more writing advice or you want to watch interviews with some writing pros, be sure to subscribe to my channel and ring that bell. I post videos on Wednesdays. It's a huge help to my author platform when you subscribe and ring the bell, so please and thank you. We'll love you forever, right? Butters will also love you forever, right? She agrees. And a friendly reminder, The Savior's Champion and The Savior's Sister are available in ebook, paperback, hardback, and audiobook. So if you enjoy award-winning dark fantasy romance and you want to read books that feature trauma and PTSD, look no further. I got them linked below. A quick announcement, a huge thank you to everyone who participated in the Savior series fan art contest. The winners have been contacted and we are just waiting for them to reply and claim their prizes. And once that happens, I will go ahead and announce the winners. But thank you so, so much to everyone who participated. You created such amazing, beautiful art that I will cherish forever. You guys are seriously the most talented readers out there. I love you. Now let's dive into the questions. Iona, are you ready?
I'm ready, but a quick disclaimer, these are all my personal preferences and things that I personally interpret trauma specialization to be and what I like to see in fiction and what I think is not problematic. Also, these are going to be a really quick overview, a general overview. There's obviously way more in depth of that. People can go into it when they decide to research on their own.
Okay, question number 1. We'll start with the basics. Can you define trauma, PTSD, and CPTSD?
Yes. So trauma is anything that causes the body and the brain to kind of flip over into fight, flight, or freeze response. There are some extras that are possibly being added in, like FAWN and FIDGET, but I can talk more about those in a little bit. PTSD is a diagnosis given to someone who's been through trauma. Just because someone's been through trauma, unfortunately, that's like a really common human experience, but it doesn't mean that it turns into a diagnosis. What causes the diagnosis is if there are trauma survival symptoms that are affecting the person during their daily life in a negative way. CPTSD stands for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. This isn't in the DSM-5. That's the diagnostic statistical manual that therapists and mental health clinicians in the United States use, but it's still really well known among clinicians. But the difference that is kind of on the down low, understood by clinicians, is that what makes complex trauma complex is either repetitive or diverse types of really intense trauma for someone, usually before the age of 10, but not necessarily to that point. It can be over weeks, months, years for that person.
Yeah, it's funny because I've been hearing about CPTSD for a while, but I never really understood what it was. And I talked to someone and they said more or less that it basically, instead of just one traumatic event, it's like a prolonged period of trauma or stress. And I was like, oh, I think that more accurately defines my PTSD, but I was diagnosed with PTSD, not CPTSD. And so now knowing CPTSD, is it sort of officially being recognized by is it DSM-5? Is that what it's called? Yeah. So now knowing that it's not being officially recognized, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Question number 2, what are some typical reactions to trauma that writers can reflect in their work?
So there are many different kinds of trauma reactions. I briefly mentioned them before, but there's fight, and that kind of is an example of like someone who might throw hands or use really harsh words or cutting words to protect themselves in a really scary or traumatic situation. There's flight. That's what it sounds like, is someone trying to find an escape plan, avoid something, or run away from a certain kind of scary situation. Freeze can show up in a variety of different ways. Some of these is dissociation, so kind of like losing touch with the body or the surroundings, or even having different altered states of reality for that person. Freeze can also mean that you're not able to use different body parts as you used to be able to use them. Another way that freeze can show up is if someone starts to use like a really flat affect, which just means that their facial expressions aren't as expressive or the tones in their voice aren't expressive when normally they are really expressive. It's kind of speculated, and some people already do include this in their description of like a trauma response, but there's something called FAWN, which means that the person's like fawning over the individual that's harming them or the traumatic situation. So like, for instance, if they have like kind of a triggering boss that they might work with, they might resort to fawning, like being like, oh my gosh, I love your hair, or like, I love how you handled that situation. It's just like giving these like flattery or complimentary things to another person or to a situation to kind of diffuse the situation so it's not as traumatic for the person. And then another one that's kind of speculated on is fidget, leg tapping, finger tapping. Sometimes people pass gas, like sometimes people use like fidget spinners or different like sensory things. It's not someone who is normally soothed by these though, because there are lots of different like neurodivergent tendencies that cause people in different kinds of brains to be drawn to fidgeting. That's not what I'm talking about. It's more like someone who normally isn't that way, but might bounce their leg when they're feeling really threatened. Also keep in mind that like everyone reacts differently to trauma. And even if it's a similar or same traumatic event happening, you can use like a combination of things depending on what's going on that day, or during those moments, a person can just use one that they normally wouldn't use. It's your brain trying to come up with the best strategy to handle that situation, and no one can help what pops out as their first reaction.
That makes so much sense, because a lot of what you explained, I mean, like I already knew about fight, flight, or freeze, but people don't really know the like depth that goes into. And a lot of what you explained, I'm like sitting here thinking, oh, I can think of a time that I did that, and I can think of a time. And then I never really understood what FAWN was. Now I do. That makes sense. Third question, what are some believable symptoms of PTSD or CPTSD that writers can reflect in their work?
So just keep in mind, like as the creator of whatever work you're making, that trauma symptoms are there because it's the brain trying to protect the body. It's not because someone's like inherently bad or trying to be difficult or anything like that. So if you are writing a character, just remember that whatever symptoms they're showing used to help them in a traumatic event. Maybe they're not in that situation anymore, but there might be triggers that makes their brain think that that thing is happening again. And so that's what causes them to have these behaviors kind of flare up. The DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual in its 5th edition, currently has several categories that clinicians use to diagnose someone with PTSD. As of right now, in 2022, the first one is intrusion. These are intrusive memories or sensations that typically show up after like a trigger of some sort. These can be automatic thoughts, memories, nightmares, flashbacks, and the person might even emotionally feel like whatever happened to them is happening again. There's avoidance, which is exactly what it sounds like. Someone's trying to avoid something, but something that I think is really important is to include in your work that over time, avoidance becomes more and more overgeneralized. So like if someone was in a fender bender, but it really triggered their trauma part of their brain to turn on, and then it is stored as a trauma memory, and then it becomes PTSD, someone might have started avoiding a road that fender bender happened on, but then it'll overgeneralize into, well, I don't want to drive at all. I just want to be a passenger. And then it'll turn into, well, I don't want to even get into the car. And then it'll turn into so on and so forth. The next one is negative thoughts and mood. It doesn't necessarily mean like you're in a bad mood or you're thinking negative things. It can be like a pulling away of something. So something that was in abundance is now not there anymore. So if there's like a lot of joy around a particular thing like photography or writing or something creative, that person might not have the abundance of that passion for that particular thing anymore. It also means negative beliefs. So beliefs about self, like it's my fault or I did something wrong, or about the world, which I think a lot of writers can relate, but like the I hate people and the world isn't a safe place. Those are beliefs about the overall world that counts as like negative mood.
I can't relate to that at all. I just love people and I love the world. I'm just kidding. That's the least relatable thing I've ever heard.
The last caveat to a PTSD diagnosis is changes in arousal or reactions. So this can be depicted in something called hypervigilance. It means that the person is in a way like on guard all of the time. It causes sleep disturbances because the person's not usually able to relax enough to fall asleep right away, or it'll cause them to have like these racing thoughts that makes them feel really exhausted. And it can even show up as like muscle tension, because if the person is like alert and looking around all the time, it'll really affect their like shoulders, neck, back, all that stuff. Anywhere where their muscles store the trauma memory, it's their body basically overreacting or being over prepared for any possible danger that might pop up for them.
On the one hand, I'm listening to this list and going, wow, I have a lot more symptoms than I thought I did. But at the same time, I'm also realizing that I included and am continuing to include a lot more symptoms of PTSD than I thought in my writing. A lot of examples you gave that I didn't actually know were PTSD symptoms, I put into Tobias and Layla, because to me, I'm like, well, if I was in this situation, I would probably feel like this.
Well, that is exactly why I liked reading your book so much, because it had such a natural and like not over the top representation of trauma, and like it made sense for the characters and the trauma that they particularly went through. It wasn't like self-insert, or it wasn't like they must meet every single diagnostic criteria. Like it made sense for them in those situations. That's why I loved it so much.
Thank you so much. That just made my day. Question number 4. Are there any common misconceptions or stereotypes that show up in fiction that writers should avoid?
I could talk about this all day, but I will just pick a few that come to mind.
Yeah, I'm sitting here like, okay, we could make a whole video just about this. Maybe one day we will. It'll be like the 10 worst common misconceptions, but I'll give you the floor.
I would totally be down for that. So a couple things that come to mind are how intersectionality is not included. And without me turning this into a long ass TED talk, intersectionality just means that things like race, age, body type, ability, gender, sexual orientation, all those things plus a trauma can like compound each other. It almost has a different response in the body, or the body might even be more likely or less likely to develop PTSD in particular because of these things. And that intersectionality is really important because it helps diversify like what you're writing. So like, for instance, like Layla in your book has completely different trauma responses than Tobias, and both of them have been through really intense, critical things, even within the same 4 walls, but it's not going to show up the same for both of them because there's different intersectionality going on with them. So like for my character, Angela, she's Latinx and she's a woman, and she's also like the youngest in her family. All of these things combine together to cause her to have more like of the avoidance and the flashbacky type of symptoms. Also, PTSD PTSD does not just include combat trauma. Yes, that is super traumatic. Holy cow. But like anything at all that causes the brain to flip into that fight, flight, freeze mode, or it's called the sympathetic nervous response, if you really want to go real deep into that. But that is what causes trauma in someone, not someone being gatekeepy and being like, oh, combat trauma is the only thing that's traumatic for a person. Also keep in mind, there are things called secondhand trauma. This can be hearing about a really traumatic event from close loved ones or close family members. If you work like as a first responder, or a lot of times mental health professionals, if they work in a particular population and they're hearing similar stories over and over again, that can cause PTSD and at the very least a trauma response. Also having a sudden loss of a close loved one or family member can cause a trauma response as well. The next one that comes to mind is something that's kind of twofold. I like when stories show that there's like resilience after trauma. And on the one hand, I don't mean like to romanticize the abuse of like, oh, if you hadn't been through this, you wouldn't be as strong now, because that's a whole other problem. But definitely this person was faced with something that no human being should ever have to go through. There is strength in them doing the work within themselves or finding a community elsewhere that are like a community of survivors that can absolutely be really beautiful to see, and see their resiliency factors keep their brain safe, or their brain keeps their body safe in future situations. Also, just be sure not to throw the kitchen sink at it. If you want your character to have a diagnosis of PTSD, you don't have to hit every single symptom. Put the ones that make sense for them to survive that situation that is now popping up when they're not in danger. And it's also important to know that just because you want to show trauma reactions doesn't mean the person has to have PTSD either. Like this particular character could meet something called sub-threshold areas, which means that they haven't hit the minimum number of characteristics or symptomology presenting to have PTSD, but that doesn't mean that they aren't trauma survivors and they still don't have residual trauma survivorship. Something else that I know that I was surprised about learning when I was getting my specialization is that trauma reactions, they can show up right away, but there are lots of folks who it doesn't show up for them until like way later when they are, quote, safe, whatever that means for them. So they make enough money for themselves now to live off of, and they aren't hurting for money, or they have a stable place to live, or they have a partner or close friends that they feel really comfortable and safe around. And in these kinds of really safe, secure situations, trauma symptoms that they have never had before can suddenly show up because their brain's like, oh, you're safe now? Cool. I've been holding on to like a lot of shit, and like you need to deal with it now that you're okay. And people get really confused and like upset with themselves of being like, that happened 20 years ago. Why is it showing up now that I'm retired? And stuff like that. It would be really cool to see that shown in a character of just like how long it takes. And the last thing is that a lot of times I'll see someone like, and it's not just in written works, it's also like on TV a lot for some reason, where someone will actively be having like a trauma response. Like they'll actively be having a panic attack, a flashback, a nightmare, whatever. And for some reason, the creator of this fabricated situation turns it into like a steamy or a spicy scene. And I'm just like, what's happening? Because that's not the direction it would go. To the point where like,
I know what you're talking about, and I hate this so much, but continue.
It's so bad. Even like physiologically, that person is not going to be able to do that, because when the sympathetic nervous response turns on, that's the fight, flight, or freeze. But the exact opposite of that is the parasympathetic nervous response. And you know how like fight or flight is the traumatized reaction. Breed and feed, which is very gross. I hate that. But like breed and feed, or rest and digest, are the ones exactly opposite of it. So if you're in that traumatized state, you are only thinking about fight, flight, or freeze. You cannot digest food very well. You cannot have sex really, because that kind of arousal response is not possible. And you can't sleep very well. So if they're in that state, maybe it's not super believable that they would, want to have sexy time.
I am so glad you said this because that is one of my least favorite romance tropes, because not only is it completely unbelievable, but it's just kind of gross. You're seeing someone have this traumatic response. What about this is sexy? Like, I don't understand. It's just that now it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so upset my mom died. Fuck me. Like, I don't get it,
It's so like, I just lose like the believability at that point. And that's not to say, on the flip side, like if someone helps someone else through a panic attack, or someone is helping grounding their partner through like a flashback situation, then that will cause the couple to grow closer for sure. And it doesn't even have to be a couple. It'll cause any relationship at all to grow closer, because you are at a really vulnerable state, or that particular character is at a really vulnerable space, and that other person helped them and gave them exactly what they needed to be able to not be afraid and to help their brain come out of that moment. That will cause people to get together. And I also think that that's like really touching, because that's just like showing that deep bond. But the spicy stuff is gonna happen later. Not saying it won't happen at all. Like, it's not like you have to be celibate or something, but like it's not gonna happen in that exact moment.
If you are writing romance like myself, this is a perfect opportunity to show their emotional growth and their emotional bond. It can still be a quote unquote romantic moment in the sense that you're using this opportunity to grow their emotional connection. But the sexual aspect, I don't get that. I mean, I've had plenty of panic attacks and not once has it ever made me horny. If anything, it made me exhausted afterward and I just feel like, oh, okay, I'm tired. Number 5, what are some of the best ways writers can learn more about trauma, PTSD, and CPTSD if they don't have any personal experience?
A place to start is just getting to know how it's diagnosed. So like I mentioned before, the DSM-5, if you are in like a different country, like outside of the US, they use the ICD-10. At least I think that's what they use in Europe. Definitely listen to testimonials. There are beautiful, very vulnerable, well-done testimonials on YouTube and books. Being able to imagine how your character would react if they had been through certain things, and just seeing like a realistic response for it is a really great way to go. Also, just remembering they don't need to meet all the criteria. They can be sub-threshold. They could just have one little thing pop up. There's a really cool TED Talk by Nadine Burks-Harris. She goes over things called adverse childhood events. It kind of gives an array of different childhood experiences that have a physical effect on the body and is correlated, but they're starting to find that it's causal with increased different like personal physical ailments in the body. So just remembering that the body is something that holds on to trauma as well. It's not just symptoms of the brain. NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, is a good one to look at. NIM is the National Institute of Mental Health. That's another great one to visit just to look around. But there are like countless other resources out there. The internet is a scary but wonderful place at times when it comes to information.
This has nothing to do with anything, but I just need everyone to know that Buttercup has fallen asleep on my lap.
That is adorable.
I would show you, but then she would wake up. But anywho, question number 6, how can writers ensure they're not promoting harmful ideas in their writing?
Make sure that you're basing your research on like reputable sources and not just like kind of carbon copying fictional characters. A lot of times in fiction, especially the ones that are very mainstream or well known, are known to sensationalize symptoms. If you do this delicately, I would even suggest interviewing survivors of different things. You could even have a call for people who have been through similar traumas that your character has been through, as long as you handle it delicately and as long as the person consents to that kind of interview and can stop whenever they want to stop. Also, like respecting survivors and knowing realistically how different symptoms show up is a really good way to go. That way, it's not something that causes someone to lose believability in your work or will disrespect survivors in having some sort of like evil coded symptomology for a person and your work to show up. You want it to be a believable thing, because symptoms don't make someone good or bad. They are just how the brain tried to help them in the past and how the brain is kind of overshooting now. Also, of course, sensitivity readers. I'm just throwing it out there that I am a sensitivity reader for multiple things, but one of them is trauma. And then also beta readers. I would suggest finding beta readers that are trauma survivors. There's a way to ask for beta readers, like saying, hey, my book is about XYZ. I'm looking for beta readers to make sure that I'm handling this delicately. If anyone's interested, here's my book. And you can do the normal beta reader thing, but this one is an extra special call out for people to see if they're interested in fielding your work before it's out in the world. And also being like open. Just like, I know it's really hard to realize that like something you thought was true wasn't true, or something that you've seen and respect from like an actor or a particular author that you really respect a lot, but maybe the stuff they put out there isn't the best source material. It can be really hard to change your mindset on that. And just like making sure you unlearn some of the things that society has kind of taught us, because it's set up in a way that we kind of subconsciously absorb these stereotypes or these assumptions about how the brain responds to really terrible things that no one should have to go through. There's a variety of really diverse responses that people have. Trying to put people in a box can be really harmful for them.
I'm really glad you mentioned the point about not basing your characters off of fictional characters. I know recently in my exclusive Patreon writing group, Cyborg Central, someone was asking about how to write a particular kind of mental illness and what fictional characters should they turn to. And people were saying, oh, why don't you look at the Joker? And I had to go in and be like, maybe instead of looking at fictional characters, research the mental illness and write it accurately, because a lot of fictional characters, especially a lot of popular ones, are not written accurately in terms of their mental illness. And you could be a huge fan of the Joker, that's fine, you know, he's a very popular comic book character, but you could be a big fan and still recognize the fact that that probably wasn't the most accurate portrayal. And at the end of the day, there's no point in releasing entertaining fiction if it's going to be harmful to people, at least in my opinion.
Same opinion.
Moving on, question number 7. How does own voices pertain to trauma, PTSD, and CPTSD in fiction?
Unfortunately, it's really common for human beings to go through a traumatic event. It doesn't mean that the person will have that store as a trauma memory in their brain, or that they'll have trauma symptoms for the rest of their life or anything like that. But just like knowing that this is really common, there might be a lot of own voices authors out there. Also, lots of own voices authors, when it pertains to trauma, probably know that like just because someone has a PTSD diagnosis doesn't mean they'll have it forever. People can go through treatment, and sometimes even naturally without treatment, if the brain doesn't try and overgeneralize like I was talking about before. Even naturally, sometimes people can overcome traumatic experiences in their lives. So by having own voices authors out there, it includes people that may still be struggling with this, who may have overcome it, and it just kind of brings all of their voices together and lets them portray something that's really nuanced and unique to that person. There also tends to be, at least from people who were forthcoming, and no one has to say, oh, I'm an own voices author for trauma. The ones that have said that and it has piqued my interest and had me want to read their work, I have noticed that they include really diverse symptomology. It's a really reliable representation, and there's very different scenes and reactions that really link back to that particular character surviving trauma in the past and it popping up for them now. I also want to make sure I point out that even if someone is an own voices author, though that is very important, sometimes we have internalized some misrepresentations or some assumptions about the disorder. So I still suggest like getting beta readers, being open to feedback, maybe even getting a sensitivity reader, because just because you have this disorder doesn't mean that you might not harbor some of those untrue thoughts or assumptions within yourself. And I also, on the flip side, want to say, just because someone's been through trauma, they are not expected to write about anything that they don't want to. They don't have to write about their own trauma. They don't have to write about trauma adjacent stuff for their characters. They don't have to write about trauma at all.
I'm so glad that you mentioned having people read your work, even if it is own voices, because I have PTSD or CPTSD, and you know who still reads my work? Iona Wayland, because she's a pro. She's a trauma specialist. I'm getting lots of puppy kisses. Buttercup has risen from her nap. Hello, I'm back. I'm back.
Hi, buddies.
I'm here to learn. I'm here to learn. Question number 8. Let's talk triggers. Are trigger warnings important, and why do they matter when writing trauma or PTSD?
Although we can't possibly predict what all the triggers are for someone, just having those broad, non-specific ones can be really helpful for your readers, especially even if they're not your target audience. I think what's going to end up happening is there's going to be someone out there that has been through something similar or is having symptomology pop up for them that's going to be reading your book. And we want to make sure that your readers are okay and that people are in the right headspace to read certain kinds of works. Sometimes the argument, I don't even want to say argument, but kind of like some hesitancy behind like not wanting to put trigger warnings or content warnings in the book is like, it'll give it away. And so I'd like to argue the kind of opposite. You don't have to give anything away. You can keep it kind of broad. You also need to keep in mind when people read your work, even if you're not thinking of it from a humanitarian perspective and you're thinking of it more of like money and marketing perspective, if you have someone that reads your book that isn't in the right mental headspace for it, and there could have been a content warning to let them read it at a different time, that person might not mentally be able to finish your book. So you'll have a lot of DNFs or did not finishes, and maybe even give bad reviews on your work because they weren't prepared to read it and they didn't like the experience that they had. Also, it's just important to remember that the point of your story is not to use a traumatic experience that probably a lot of your readers have been through as shock value or a twist, because that's just really exploiting a whole community of people. You can still have a certain thing be like shocking or twisty or like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that would happen, because that's the beauty of reading. At the same time, doing it in a way that's like respectful to your audience is really important.
First of all, I agree 100%. Second, when people say it's going to spoil it, let's look at the Savior's Champion and its content warnings. Its trigger warnings are there's graphic violence, adult language, and sexual situations. Okay, well, it's a romance book, and lots of romance books have sexual situations. So that's not much of a spoiler because a lot of people go into romance expecting sexual situations. If you follow my channel, you know that I say fuck all the time. So saying that there's adult language, also not much of a spoiler. There are bloody handprints on the cover. So me saying that there's going to be graphic violence, that's also kind of obvious based on the cover. My point being that trigger warnings, if you are marketing your book correctly, they are not going to be spoilers. If you're not going to do it for your readers' well-being, think of it from a selfish point of view, I guess, you know, like it only helps yourself and your marketing. You are making sure your book is being consumed by the right people. Number 9, we learn from the masters, and we've got a master right here. So let me ask you this. How do you represent trauma, PTSD, or CPTSD in your own work? You can be as detailed as you want, or if you want to avoid spoilers, that's fine too, but just give us a little taste.
So I did mention before that some of the symptomology of one particular character, the main character, Angela, she has more of the avoidance type symptoms. And then when she can't avoid, then she has more kind of flashbacky type symptoms. But I also made sure that the whole plot was not centered around what was the trauma? What happened to her? Where did this come from? Oh my gosh, I want to see who did what to whom. I made sure I included what happened to Angela really early on in the book, like within the first 25%, because I didn't want the story to center around finding out what happened and that being her defining moment. I also made sure that like symptomology and diagnoses aren't a character trait. Like a person, a human being has more agency than that. Angela is Angela on her own, and then her particular symptoms show up because of how she coped with what happened to her. And then I also like really got to know Angela. I got to know all the characters, but I just like really got to know each one and made sure I knew how they were, just in a nuanced way, in a detailed way. And that way, how their trauma responses affected their daily life made more sense. I made sure that I had beta readers that went through similar things and resonated with what happened to Angela, with what happened to Donnie, with what happened to Wyatt. And I also really, this is just a personal preference that I want to make sure I put in all of my work, is that there's like hope in life after trauma, with a loss of a loved one, or with feeling homesick for a home that you're never going to have or never have had. Just having those deep feelings, but also knowing that there's hope afterward, was just important for me to make sure that it was included in the writing.
What I loved about Ashes, like I said, it was my favorite read of 2021. It was fucking amazing because it was handled so brilliantly. And like you said, Angela isn't defined by her trauma and, you know, her trauma responses. If I were to describe Angela, trauma isn't even something that would come up for me. Like, my favorite moment, I hope that it's okay for me to say this, is when she was in the woods and her hair got all tangled up and it just all messed up. And then Wyatt very politely is like, okay, well, let's try and, you know, take care of your hair. And she's like, oh no, I did this on purpose. I like this. And he's just like, oh, because it looks so terrible. Yeah, okay. Yeah. And he's trying to be so nice. And she's like, yeah, this is on purpose. It's just a new thing I'm going for. And then she's like, I'm just kidding. Can you please cut my hair? Like, can you? That was one of my favorite moments. And for me, if I were to describe Angela, I would go to that scene. To me, that's character. You know, it was like so specific to her personality. She's just like goofing with this guy and he totally believes her. He's like, oh shit, I just insulted her wacky hairstyle. But really, it was just, she was just fucking with him. Everyone go buy Ashes. I'm just saying. So the last question, if anyone's interested in learning more from you, Iona, where can they do that?
So I'm most active on Instagram, although I'm trying my hand at TikTok. We'll see how that goes. And there, my handle is at Iona.Wayland. If you are interested in the type of sensitivity readership I do, because I mentioned trauma here, but there's a bunch of other topics that I know about and that I like to read for, you can find my rates and the list of all the things that I can sensitivity read for on my author website. And then, of course, if you're interested in buying Ashes, it's available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook on Amazon and Audible.
So that's all we got for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. I always love having you on my channel. We always learn so much and have so much fun.
Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be on your channel, and I love these questions. And so thank you so much for including me.
I've got Iona's information in the description below. Be sure to check out her sensitivity reading as well as her debut novel, Ashes. It is a phenomenal story as well as a masterclass in writing trauma. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I post new videos on Wednesdays, and if you want to be alerted as soon as I upload, ring that bell. The Savior's Champion and The Savior's Sister are available in ebook, paperback, hardback, and audiobook. So if you enjoy magic, romance, and a whole lot of fictional trauma, check them out. They are links below. And be sure to follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Tumblr, Facebook, and BookBub. And of course, you can tweet me at Jenna Moreci. Bye!
This is Musumi. Per orders, you must subscribe to Jenna's channel and ring that bell. Your sovereign commands it. Any deviation from his word will be penalized harshly, so if you know what's good for you, subscribe.